All right. So we're talking to Jordan Cruz from Country Roads Webcast right here on YouTube. Be sure and sub him up. Also has a Country Roads podcast, which is on about everything. Apple, Spotify, you name it, he's on there. Well, let's talk a little bit about some depth. I know you've mentioned a lot of the depth that we have covering some things. So you've mentioned the ones and twos on just about every position. Let's go down to depth a little bit. Let's say we've got an injury or something to one of our starters, and our second, third stringer have to come in. What do you see on our depth? Do we have some good talent that maybe it's just not developed yet that will come along through the year? That if we would lose a player at game 6, we may be able to fill in with? How is our depth?
I think depth is obviously always one of the biggest areas of concern for West Virginia. It's something that we've kind of struggled with throughout our early years, in this our first decade here in the Big 12. At times that's kind of been the thing that's bit us as we've suffered injuries, and it's really cost us. I mentioned Charles Woods last season, but then you can look at even the year when, West Virginia had Will Greer there in 2018. They suffered injury after injury at that linebacker position. They really hurt that defense ultimately at the end of the season. So depth is something that West Virginia's really tried to continue to develop, and I think this coaching staff's doing a good job of it. The transfer portal era may have hampered that a little bit as they've lost some of the pieces as they've tried to build that depth. But I think right now they have really good young talent on this roster. If they can manage to keep it around for the future, I think it bodes well for the future of West Virginia football. And, some of those young pieces that really stand out to me, I think a look at cat safety. Christian Stokes is going to be a redshirt freshman for the Mountaineers this year. I think he has a bright future for this program and could factor in as a reserve player that sees some snaps this upcoming season for West Virginia. Then at cornerback, I look at a guy like Malachi Ruffin, right? Last season, we saw Malachi Ruffin really be counted upon in a lot of ways that West Virginia wasn't expecting him to be counted upon. The injury to Charles Woods that I've talked about, a couple of times here on this live stream, of course, led into that, and the fact that a lot of the pieces behind him were really young. Jacoby Spells, Andrew Wilson-Lamp, who I talked about earlier, who are really ready to contribute and be a big factor this year. Maybe last year were, thrust into action a little bit before they were ready. So West Virginia had to call upon Malachi Ruffin, who was a former walk-on, been around the program a long time, going to be a redshirt senior for the Mountaineers this year. And when they called upon him in early to mid part of the season, he really struggled to begin that season. But then I think as we saw the season go on, we really saw Malachi Ruffin come into his own to the point that in those late season wins that West Virginia was able to manage over, Oklahoma State, he really made some key plays in both of those games that helped West Virginia secure those wins to the point that now I think he's a player that West Virginia can count upon in the secondary. And he's even factoring into the competition to be a starter at one of those two cornerback positions. I think if you're looking at those two cornerback positions, the three names I mentioned earlier, Montre Miller, Andrew Wilson-Lamp, and Jacoby Spells, with Malachi Ruffin are the four names that you're kind of having compete for those two cornerback positions and will probably be your two deep, with Beanie Bishop being the other guy that'll factor in there and I think be more of a slot corner for West Virginia, a nickel corner in passing situations. So even though he's not that young, I think Malachi Ruffin is a great depth piece at the cornerback position. And then moving down to the next level at the linebacker position for West Virginia, I touched on him a little bit earlier at the spear position, but Raleigh Collins, I think, was an underrated recruit for West Virginia in last year's class. I think he'll be a great depth piece at the linebacker position and could potentially even steal some snaps at that spear spot behind Hershey McLaurin and Lance Dixon, who will probably be the top two there if Anthony Wilson and Keyshawn Cobb don't factor in at the spear there for West Virginia. And then at the will linebacker spot, Ben Cutter, the true freshman to me that stands out as one of the most talented in this class that I think flew under the radar for West Virginia. Not that high rated of a recruit, but has great potential to factor in early here in 2023 as a true freshman, especially since he enrolled early and has kind of been in the mix there at that spot. Josiah Trotter, like I mentioned, is going to be a factor in the future. Won't be a depth piece this year, but definitely down the line. Tyreek Austin Cave, the transfer from Miami, I think, in my opinion, should be the one to get the reserve snaps to spell Lee Koba there at the Mike linebacker position. I really like his potential. I don't know why he didn't see those last season, but I hope that the coaching staff has really came around to him this season and he gets those reserve snaps there at that spot. Then at the Bandit, Tyron Bradley and James Hurd, to me, the two best reserves West Virginia has there, behind Jared Bartlett. And then along the defensive line, I touched on some of the reserves there earlier, but I think Jalen Thornton, the legacy player, is going to be a guy that factors in on the edge for West Virginia, as will Torres Simmons if you're talking returning guys. And then as far as players coming in for West Virginia on the edge, Braden Dudley, a transfer in, as well as Tomiwa Durage, a transfer in from Kentucky, are guys that can be reserve players for West Virginia off the edge. And then there in the middle, whether you're talking defensive tackle or nose tackle, Asani Redwood, I think, is a guy that's going to, see some snaps this season, and as will Zakai Lawton, the transfer in from Cincinnati. And then at the nose tackle, I think the two biggest reserves is a guy I mentioned earlier, Fatorma Mulbo, the transfer in from Penn State, and Corey McIntyre Jr., late signee here to the 2023 class, but finally got on campus here ahead of fall camp, and, of course, a legacy player that could factor in on the defensive line. So, top reserves, I'll just go through, name a couple here at each level just to kind of sum it up as I close out here. I think the top reserves among the defensive line, I'll give you three names here amongst, if I'm not talking the two deep for West Virginia. I think along the defensive end position, Jalen Thornton, Braden Dudley probably be your top reserves there at the defensive end spot. And then in the middle, you're looking at Asani Redwood, Zakai Lawton, Fatorma Mulbo as your top reserves. And then at the middle level there along the linebacker position, look at Ben Cutter, Tyreek Austin Cave, Tyron Bradley, and James Hurd. Cornerback position, I think, the aforementioned names of Jacoby Spells, Montre Miller, Andrew Wilson-Lamp, and Malachi Ruffin will be your two deep there at either one of those two cornerback spots, with Beanie Bishop factoring in and filling in as kind of a nickel or slot corner. And then I think safety position, Spear, you're looking at Raleigh Collins as a reserve, and then deep safety, you're going to see Keyshawn Cobb, Christian Stokes, Anthony Wilson.